Okay. Hi, everyone. This is Ed, just the chair of Sports Physical Therapy New Jersey. And today we have Scott Epsley with us. He's the Director of Player Health and Performance with New York Gotham FC, which is part of the women's professional soccer team. And but prior to that, he's also worked high-level sports with Georgetown Division I athletes. And after that, he went to the NBA with the 76ers, and I believe he did some other work with other NBA teams as well. But I'll have Scott go over his past training, certifications, and his work with pro teams. And we'll get started with his talk on the evolution of sports, PT, and professional sports. All right, take it away, Scott.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks, everybody, for attending late at night. Hopefully, you've got a glass of wine or a beer in hand, and you can sit back and relax and listen to me talk here. But Ed's asked me to discuss the evolution of sports physical therapy, and I think 27 years and counting into my career now, originating in Australia, having moved to the United States in 2008, and having worked in both countries in elite and professional sport. Hopefully, I've got some perspective to share with you guys on where we've come from, especially in the United States. There's been a lot of progress, and the people that went before you have done a lot of work to advance sports physical therapy in this country and put it on the map so that now it's an integral part of many professional sports teams, college sports medicine departments, and the likes. So I'm going to give a bit of an overview of where I came from and how I sort of got into this. And we're going to talk about the structure of sports medicine teams, delve into a little bit of what we do at Gotham and how we're a little bit different. We're going to talk about some fun anecdotes and some experiences that I've had, looking also at some research that I've done, and particularly with the large uptick this year in Achilles tendon ruptures in the NBA, a brief discussion of that as well. So hopefully you find something that piques your interest. I'm going to talk about kind of pathways to work in elite sport, maybe an unpopular take on that, but I'm going to give it to you straight how I see it. So let's get into it. And we can take questions at the end. We have plenty of time for questions at the end. So just you can save those and pop them in the chat, I guess, and we can take those. So starting in Australia, started my career in 1999, graduated at the end of 1998. Spent my first year just working in private practice, just getting my feet wet, and then really focused on sports after that. I didn't really found, I guess I purchased a company, and then I kind of transformed it about an hour and a half outside of the city of Brisbane, which is the northernmost major capital city on the east coast of Australia. Most people know Sydney, some people know Melbourne. Brisbane's the one above that, about halfway up the east coast of the country. And it was in a sort of semi-rural town. The name of that company is Peak Performance Sports Medicine, Sports Physiotherapy, and you see it there. That's the company is still up and running. A couple of my former staff purchased it, and that's the logo that I designed many years ago, still in use. It's on the top of a mountain, and thus the mountainous looking images there. But Peak Performance was really a base for me to operate out of and to get what I call my database, and to really build my experience level in treating athletes. We were very lucky. We a town of about 100,000 people in Toowoomba, and out of those 100,000 people, we had about 13 Olympians, which is pretty crazy when you think about the density of it. And I was the only really sports medicine clinic in town. We had 6 orthopedic surgeons, one of whom was sports oriented. And we had a very close relationship, but I'd already developed a very strong network in the city of Brisbane. And so the problem with being in a semi-rural area is that everybody has got to go to Brisbane, to the major city, to get a level of care that you would kind of consider, elite, above standard, especially for an elite athlete. And so what we were able to do was to provide that care in the local community. And through necessity and through trying to prevent people from getting in the car, driving an hour and a half down, driving an hour and a half back, having to go back for follow-ups. I work closely with physicians and also really develop my skills. I spent a lot of time in the OR. I would see patients. I would get their MRIs. I would look at their MRIs. I would learn how to read them. I would go to the radiology department. I would spend my weekends sitting with a radiologist looking at MRIs. I would be back in my clinic till 8:30, 9:30 at night, looking over papers, correlating that to the MRI back in the day that we still had light boxes and it wasn't online like it is now. And really, honing my skills in sports medicine and sports physiotherapy from a diagnostic standpoint. We'll talk a little bit about delving into diagnostic ultrasound, but that's kind of where that all started for me. And also, again, being, I guess, a go-to for, elite athletes and Olympians in our town. Part of my journey in Australia, initially, I interned with a team in the National Basketball League. I played basketball through high school and college in Australia, and the team in Brisbane, the Brisbane Bullets. And actually, one of our former assistant coaches, the son of famous New York Knicks, Patrick Ewing. His son is now an assistant coach at the Brisbane Bullets, and caught up with Patrick when I was back in Australia in December, which is kind of cool. But yeah, interned there and ended up getting invited to go on the road to help them out, and that was really my first foray into professional sport. But other than that, did a lot of other things. Worked with Touch Football Australia, helped out at the national championships, and that's where I met my first mentor. And he really taught me a lot. He'd been working in Australian professional football and taught me a lot about working in professional sport in Australia, and also helped me really hone a number of my techniques, my acute injury management. And I really just gave every opportunity I could to find opportunities to cover sporting events. I worked with Basketball Australia. I covered the under 14, the under 16, the under 18 national basketball championships that were held in Brisbane. Physios in Australia, we do the on-field and the rehab coverage. It's much more like Europe, much more like the EPL. The physio is kind of both the AT and the physio. And so that really helped me to hone my acute management skills. It also gave me an opportunity to look at, differences between age groups across athletes. Under 14s really didn't get hurt that much. They bend when they fall. They tend not to break. Maybe you had a fractured finger. By the time we got to under 16s, I had to line up out the door around the back, and I had ice on everybody, and I couldn't, I was there till 11 o'clock every night and back at 6 o'clock every morning, and they all get hurt, and they're kind of uncoordinated and gangly, and they've had their growth spurt, and you name it. We had everything from fractures to dislocations. We had the lot. And then by the time they get to under 18s, they're a bit more coordinated, and they do a bit better, and they tend to get the typical injuries that most higher level athletes get. And of course, it's sprained MCLs, the odd ACL, ankle sprains, those types of things. And so that taught me a lot about just seeing the gamut of injuries as they occur through the lifespan of a young athlete, which was really important. And then I got an opportunity to work with Hockey Australia, and in Australia, field hockey is really big. This is not ice hockey, this is field hockey. And so we were the national champions at the time, we're the Olympic champions, and a number of my athletes in Toowoomba were members of the Hockey Australia team. And so I was the head therapist for the junior national team, and then worked a lot with Australian team players and state teams and what have you. And so that was a great experience, and my first experience working internationally with elite sport. In Toowoomba, we had a rugby team called the Toowoomba Bears. Our clinics actually ended up servicing 4 rugby teams. This is where I really cut my teeth. This is where I learned everything I really know about acute injury management. Being rural, rugby was really a really big game. It's the biggest thing to do on a Saturday. We might drive 4 hours to a town of 200 people, and there's 200 people at the game. And the nearest hospital is back 4 hours away. And if something really bad happens, you're it. And so maybe there's a doctor in town and he might be on call, but he's never reduced a dislocated shoulder and he has no idea about an acute sports injury. So you've got to make some pretty big decisions, some pretty important decisions. You've got to make them on the fly, and you've got to be really freaking good because otherwise the health and the care of your player is at risk. So that's where I cut my teeth, and that's where I really learned how to do sideline sports medicine. Was doing that for 7 years in the wind and the rain and the cold, and I think Ed knows all about that and his experiences. But moving beyond that, I ended up working with a time trial champion cyclist, and I got to learn a lot about professional cycling, and that's important because one thing I want to show you about your careers is that it's an absolute web, and you never know how these things are going to come back and intersect. So this gentleman, Nathan O'Neill is his name, he's going to come up in our story a few times here tonight. And then there's another fellow that's going to come up. His name is Will Power. That's his real name. If you follow IndyCar or motor racing, you will know him from Team Penske. And he is an Indy 500 winner, 2 times Indy car champion. And Will is from Toowoomba. So Will and I work together as well, and he's going to come up in our story a little bit here later too. I also work with, professional sprinting, famous sprint race in Australia called the Stall Gift, and had a sprinter who won that. The winner of that race gets their name on a postage stamp. So a very eclectic beginning in Australia. So we get to 2007 and you say, well, why did you move to America? And the real truth is, a new challenge. So we jump on a plane and we fly to the United States and we look for a new challenge. What really sparked that? Well, it was my friend Will Power, the IndyCar driver here at the top, and it was my other friend Nathan O'Neill. And Nathan had invited me out here to work a cycling event. He was with the domestic team, HealthNet at the time. And I worked that, got really good feedback. People said, hey, you should probably think about moving to the States. You're really good at this. Will said, I can't find somebody like you in the States. You should think about moving here. So took the plunge, sold everything in Australia and made the move to the United States. Now, it wasn't all easy. Getting a license here, if you're a foreign trained professional, can be incredibly difficult and improved so, mainly because of the general ed requirements, despite having 2 degrees and undergraduate in physiotherapy and postgraduate in sports physiotherapy and way more credit hours than I ever could possibly need in physical therapy education. I did not have the gen ed requirements, and so ended up taking night classes, a night chemistry class, taught myself economics, sat CLEP exams, did that for a year, and it was about a year and a half until I was finally granted permission to sit the national PT exam. So again, everybody always wants to know how you got to where you are, but nobody really gets to see, what you actually did to get to where you are. So I want to make sure you guys are aware. Not everybody has that experience, but if you really want something and you really believe that's where you're supposed to be, then go after it relentlessly and don't give up. Is my message to you tonight. So I get connected with Georgetown, and ultimately that turns into a random meeting with Coach John Thompson III. So big Coach Thompson, any of you college basketball people, his son, who was the Georgetown coach. The irony of this story is I'm about 2 weeks away from moving back to Australia. Things weren't going as great in the US as I'd hoped. I'd been here a year. I'd had my experience, and I was kind of ready to move back. Wasn't really breaking into things in sport the way that I'd hoped I might. And so he asked me to treat him. He gets off the table. After that, I was on my way out the door to have dinner with the team doctor and say, thanks very much. It was nice meeting you, nice to work with you, enjoyed the ride. The team Georgetown had already said they couldn't create a position for me. Coach gets off the table and says, why don't we have you on staff? I want you on staff. So I go up the next afternoon and they say, well, we're going to create a position for you. So I go back to Australia for 3 months while over the summer they work on the logistics, they create a position, they work on my visa. And I come back and the rest is history. And this has been, the US has been my home effectively ever since. Out of working with Georgetown, a fellow by the name of Otto Porter Jr. gets drafted to the Washington Wizards. And I'd had Otto at Georgetown. He'd had a number of issues that we'd worked through, but he'd never missed a game with me. He gets injured in the preseason, and things aren't going quite as well for him from a rehab perspective. So he asked the team, can he come back and see Scott at Georgetown? Their head trainer, Eric Waters, who's now with Chicago, great friend of mine, great guy, always open to learning, says, sure, I'd love to see what Scott does. Can I come along? So he comes back to Georgetown. And I treat him, he gets better, and before you know it, the Wizards are asking me to do all their rehabs when they're on the road, to help out with some of their rehabs at home and their longer term post surgeries. That then fast forwards to doing some consulting locally in the DC area through MedStar, who has at that time had the contract with the Capitals and the Nationals, and then an opportunity came up to go to the Philadelphia 76ers. And this is where my friend Nathan O'Neill and the cyclist comes in. So it turns out that the 76ers head coach was a guy by the name of Brett Brown. Well, Brett Brown was a very well-known coach. He coached the Australian national basketball team, so he's very well-known in Australia. He coached a number of domestic teams in the Australian National League. And a very good friend of mine from Australia, whose name you will recognize from the tendon world, Jill Cook, was his physio. On top of that, the person that was going to be my boss, that Philadelphia had just hired as their performance director, was also the sports scientist for the Australian Institute of Sport, and guess what? The cycling team. So he and I had worked together with Nathan. So here's this tangled web coming back into play many years later in Philadelphia, in the United States, with all of these characters that had popped up in my life in strange ways. And so I go to Philly, and this is where the evolution of sports physio story comes in. I was the first physical therapist full-time that the team had ever had on staff. Now, this is 2016. This is not 2010 or 2011. And so when you think about the evolution of our profession, it's very, very rapidly grown. You would be hard-pressed to find a team in the NBA, the NFL, the MLB that does not have a physical therapist on staff, if not two or three. So, we've gone from that to where we are now very, very quickly. And so I set about building a department, a physiotherapy department. I hired another guy. I started working on our screening programs. I started working on our athlete monitoring programs. And I introduced diagnostic ultrasound into the training room and worked with our physicians to get them comfortable with us using that. And then we started doing some research looking into tendon elastography, which is something that I'm continuing to do with the MBA now. And so we grew that, and one thing led to another, and then they elevated me to medical director. Ultimately, COVID hit and developed a lot of COVID policies, a lot of late nights. But after the bubble, decided it was time to go back to Australia for a little bit and spend some time with my family. And so did that and came back to the United States kind of toward the end of COVID. The Sixers kept me on as a consultant during that time. And then began just consulting full time. Well, just random things kept happening. The phone rang, and it was a friend of mine who'd just gotten a job with the Australian women's national team, actually Football Australia, the men's and women's national team, as the performance director for both teams. But he said, listen, our women's team is going on a camp, and we really want you to come along with another colleague that I believe you know, and we want you to run some performance testing for them and show us what an elite level kind of, performance evaluation, screening battery looks like. Well, the fellow that I was to go away with was a fellow that I graduated with at the University of Queensland in 1998, hadn't spoken to for about 20 years. And he was working in professional football and soccer over in the UK, lives just outside of London. So we teamed up and met in Ireland and did a 3-week camp with the Matildas and worked together as if we'd never not worked together before in our lives. And I can tell you that that was one of the most rewarding experiences I've ever had. And his name is Peter Lyon, and I love Pete, and I would work with him any day. It was a very long and arduous camp, very many late nights trying to put all this data together and present a product to the players and the team at the end of it, but very rewarding. And that's the story of how I entered into the sport of football and soccer. I came back and that didn't happen immediately. I was starting to get questions to consult for the New York Yankees, who I still consult for, the New England Patriots. These are not all the teams I've consulted for. This is just to give you a bit of an idea of some of the teams. I did some work with the Pittsburgh Penguins, and then started to get some interest in consulting for some teams in the EPL. Manchester City had a colleague who ended up going and working there, Arsenal, the Australian Football League, and various other teams. So that led to my consulting. Through that, I was continuing to work with individual players, some big names, and one of them was injured and ended up getting traded to the Brooklyn Nets. And so I ended up embedded for the best part of, well, in and out for 2 seasons, but the most part of last season, not this most recent, the one before, working, with him with the Brooklyn Nets. And so had another kind of MBA experience, as it were, in a different organization, getting to see how people did things differently. But come back to the Matildas, and my basketball world and my football world collide again. I don't know if any of you are basketball fans, but if you are, you will know the commentator Jeff Van Gundy. It turns out that one of my Australian national team players was actually roommates and lived in Jeff Van Gundy's house with another US women's national team player who was injured. So one thing led to another. They recommend me to the US women's national team player. She flies to DC. I start working with her where I have a house in DC, and then she starts telling all of her other national team friends. And then next thing you know, I'm starting to see all these national team players and a bunch of players from the Washington Spirit. And I then get asked, hey, can you go to Brooklyn? So I leave DC, I go to Brooklyn. Well, would you believe it? 3 of those players get traded from the Spirit to New York, New Jersey, Gotham FC. And that's how I end up here. So again, this tangled, crazy web of all these different worlds. And so I would say to you as the message, it's not impossible to burn bridges and to do well, but be very careful about the bridges that you burn in this industry, because you do not know where they're going to come back around. And so if you're going to burn your bridges, think very seriously about which ones it is that you might need to cross back over at some point in time. But that's a history of how I ended up here. And so I want to talk about 2 paths. And there's, as I see it in professional sport currently, and I can say this because I've interviewed a hell of a lot of therapists, and now in my role as a performance director, not just therapists. I interview strength coaches, I interview psychologists, I interview mental performance coaches, I interview massage therapists, and the 2 paths that I see are very, very distinct. The first path is kind of what I call the certification path. And it's kind of a fast track, but you really got to think about, what you're losing if you fast track. And so this is, I get my degree, I go and get 3 or 4 or 5 certifications. Everybody's got, dry needling and SFMA and something or other else. And then maybe I work in a clinic for a little bit until I get enough hours and I go do my residency. And then out of my residency, I get an internship with a team, and then woohoo, I get hired. The team's like, hey, we like you, come on board. Now, I've never really treated a patient. I've never really done a rehab that hasn't gone great. I don't really know what to do when things kind of aren't going the way that they should go. But I got a team. I'm in a team. I got my contract, and I'm working in professional sport. And those are, to be honest, the bulk of the applicants that I get across my desk. They're probably 80 to 90% of the people that apply for jobs. And a lot of sports organizations, they want people with sports experience. So getting a foot in the door and having worked in a team is great. But when I say to them, so, how many ACLs have you rehabbed? And they say, well, I did 3 or 4, and, in my residency, I did 1. And well, I've rehabbed over 350 ACLs. And so when they go north or south or east or west, I've kind of seen it. I've kind of done all the testing. I've kind of seen all the permutations and all the variations. And so I'm going to present the second path, And yes, you can already tell my bias, but this is a pathway that develops your database. And this is a pathway to making you a more complete therapist and a more experienced therapist. Now, experience isn't in seeing much, it's in seeing wisely. You could have 20 years experience and know no more than somebody with 5. However, if you do the experience right, and the way that I've laid this out here is a degree, I go get some experience, I identify a knowledge gap. Out of that knowledge gap, I seek out a course or a mentor or a certification. I go take that. I fill that knowledge gap. I go back to the clinic. I work. I get the experience. This is my peak performance sports medicine in Toowoomba. This is what I did there. I then go seek out an expert. I find that knowledge gap. I fill that knowledge gap. I go back to the clinic. I practice that. I put those things into place. And then I go and I find, and I keep repeating the process until I become a much more complete therapist. And then I move into the residency, the internship, but I don't stop there. I come back out and now maybe I'm working at a slightly higher level with a slightly higher level of athlete. So now I'm going to practice all those things that I've just learned, the additional skills that I've got, the on-field management, all of those things that you get out of a residency. And I'm going to put them into practice. And then I'm going to identify any other gaps in my knowledge and I'm going to fill those. And then when the opportunity arises, I'm going to apply for the sports team job. Now, I will warn you that sometimes that is an unpopular pathway with sports teams. And sometimes I have to fight very hard with front offices to get them to believe that that is the therapist that we need because of the experience piece. But when I hire a therapist that's come through that pathway, I know what I'm getting. I know what my players are getting. I know that they've got the backing behind them from an experience standpoint. And when things don't go exactly as planned, then they have that database that they can draw from. And so those are the two paths that I see, and those are the challenges with each of those paths. And it's up to each and every one of you as individuals, to kind of make a choice. There isn't a right or wrong path, but I do think that the second path leads to a more complete, well-rounded therapist. The problem with professional sport, and if you talk to if you talk to people that have been in it long enough and that are going to be actually honest with you, is that you don't get smarter in teams, you get dumber. And the reason you get dumber in teams is you're around the same people every day who know the same stuff that either you've all learnt together or that you've heard them say every day for the last 5 years, treating the same injuries. The reality is basketball players, for the most part, get the same injury. And it's very different to what a soccer player gets, and it's very different to what a cyclist gets, and it's very different to what a sprinter gets. And ultimately, your skill set starts to decline. And if you stay in it too long and you stay in one place too long, it continues to decline. And so having that database, having that breadth of experience, and this is what college did for me as well. 20 minutes an athlete, seeing 80 kids a week, and you've got 20 different sports. All right, you're making an evaluation in 5 minutes. You're determining the best course of treatment. You're working with an athletic trainer to make a plan and a recommendation, and you're moving on to the next one. And so it's the ability to do this in rapid fire and make those rapid decisions, and it's pattern recognition as well. You're seeing patterns, you're understanding what those patterns mean. You're able to make decisions very, very quickly. So as I said, I am biased. I present both options. I take the road less traveled from the Robert Frost poem here, and Ed's got a question for me.
Yeah, I was just saying, because obviously both of us have about the same experience, 27 years and similar past. So I totally agree. It's like if I just stuck with the teams the whole time, I just wouldn't have learned as much. And why do you think that is with a lot of the pro teams? Why is the front office or maybe the coaches or players, why are they looking for? I understand you definitely want people who have dealt with sports, but they tend to look for, and of course, being older, I feel like they want the people, the new grad going to residency and go bam right into it. It's almost like they think they have better energy levels or something, and I feel like if you've passed that, they feel like you just can't, almost like you're going to check out at the end of the day. You got to go see your kids. They almost think like you're going to be treating it like a 9 to 5, which of course, if you deal with sports, it can't be. But I think they just don't want to take that risk with some of the more experienced players having I guess, live the life of and no one works 9 to 5. I mean, everybody works evening shifts anyways, but why do you think that is with pro sports?
Um, I mean, for all the jobs that I've gotten, there's 20 that I didn't get, and the number of interviews that I've done, and the number of general managers I've sat with, and uh, I, what I've learned is that most professional teams don't actually know what they want. And so if you actually ask them, what is it you're looking for? How are you looking to build out a sports medicine or a performance department? They can't actually tell you. They can tell you, well, I just want this great physio, or I just want this, whatever. But they don't actually know how to build that out. And, I have been in teams where they've had elite practitioners, but the teams have functioned incredibly poorly. The players have not liked the care they've got, not because the practitioners aren't elite, but because the team is poorly constructed and it doesn't function well as a unit. And I'm going to talk about that when I talk about, Gotham FC and what we've done different. And um, but I believe that that's part of the problem is a general manager is often a former player. A former player has, their experience with our profession is whoever treated them on the table when they were a player. And that is what they're bringing to the table when they construct their performance department. And then maybe they have a buddy who, is friends with the owner, who is a sports chiropractor, who, believes in upside down underwater breathing as the best technique. And so next thing you have an owner who's talking to, the general manager saying, oh, my best friend does this technique and we should bring someone like that in. And you hear this all the time. I see this all the time when I'm either consulting with teams, trying to, help them build a department or building my own department in another team. So the number one, I think, impediment is that. I think the number two one, if I were to be really completely honest, and Ed, I think it's really hard to get a job back in the league when you've done everything that you and I have done. I'm not going to lie to everybody on this call. You almost outmarket yourself, in terms of out of these jobs. But there is, and I want to be truthful with you all. You are going to be faced with some moral conflicts between the team and what their wishes are, and the player and what's best for their health. And I think that the more experienced you are, the more likely and the more experience you have to stand up for the player and to put yourself in between that. I think it's harder when you're less experienced. You want to get your foot in the door. You want to do the right thing. You want to be a good team player. And I do think, to be honest and frank with the group on this call, is that sometimes can factor in as well. I don't know, Ed, if you've had that experience, but I
Oh, I
certainly.
mean, yeah. I mean, we've also seen the people who had those injuries when they're young and they're older now, decades later. And it's like, oh, and they never got treatment correct. And I mean, I remember treating a D3 basketball player and she had done her third ACL and no one had looked at her ankle. And I'm like, that's crazy. You're a basketball player. You've definitely sprained your ankle in the past and no one's looked at it. And she had a dysfunction there that definitely led to, and you'd figure the second would lead them to think that maybe we should look somewhere else, but they shared third. When I found out later, after she left, she moved to California and she got a fourth one. It's just like, it's kind of crazy. And it's like, it comes with the education too. Like when you see where it doesn't work, I think, like you're saying, like young people heal all the time. Like you're saying, like when they're 14, I mean, even 20-year-olds, they heal. Like we know sports injuries are going to heal. I think the people don't heal that challenge you. And then when you can troubleshoot those people, you can take those exact same skills and still use those for the young guys and just get them that much better, or prevent that mechanical chain breakdown that's going to lead to, like knee arthritis, like a few decades later, even if they're not exhibiting any knee symptoms now.
And to that point, right, we just published a paper, on, injuries that precede ACL tears in the NBA. 2 days ago, just came out. We've been working on this paper for about 2 years. But, what we found was that, I can get the number right, but I think it was 30% of players within 90 days of rupturing their ACL had had either a knee or an ankle injury. And so when we then broke that down and we looked at the time that players were sitting out for the same injuries, so we said, okay, who all in the same time frame of our study had knee and ankle injuries? Okay, how long until they played another game of basketball in the NBA after that injury? What we found was players that came back and didn't rupture their ACL took about 3 times longer to come back than players that did rupture their ACL. Now, you'd say, well, that could be a one-off, except that 2 months ago, we just published another paper with Achilles tendon ruptures where we found the exact same thing. Players that had ankle injuries, calf strains, and foot injuries came back about 3 times longer, did not rupture. Players that ruptured came back in much less time. And I'm not advocating for necessarily you have to take longer to come back from injury. We're pushing the boundaries of that in professional sport all the time. But what I am saying is, to your point, Ed, is that sometimes I think there's also just a lack of experience in recognizing some of the risks of what this means down the track.
Yeah, and also like I mean, like in the end, pro sports is entertainment, and the guys who are at the front office, like you're saying, their job is to put people in the seats, make money off merchandising, advertising, and sometimes it's at the negative consequences of the athlete's health. And in the end, they're just like, we need to get seats and people in the seats. And I know, like for example, when I was working with the Raptors physician and therapist back in Toronto, like when Vince Carter was hurt, they would never announce if he was coming back, and people would buy tickets just hoping that he would come back that game. And then they'd see him in his suit and his crutches, and they're like, "Oh, great, I guess he's not playing." But that put that many more people in the seats to just watch and buy tickets. And I think now, like you start seeing, I think in the NBA, there's that term load management, where I think Kawhi Leonard was one of the first guys I heard doing that, demanding in his contract. And now you see that because people are getting pushed to the limit where they're getting hurt and they're breaking down. And, the owner should also recognize that if your star player goes down, like, like Halliburton, like goes down in the playoffs, like your team's going to lose and it's going to affect your market share. But I think they're really pushing the boundaries more so. And the younger therapists, like you said, may not have that experience to recognize those limits, because those guys are, built differently. They're Superman, so they can take a lot more than we can. But obviously, there is reaching a point where they're even hitting their limitations.
I think you said one thing there, Ed, that I want to just highlight on. And again, I don't want to burst anyone's bubble because I love working in professional sport. And so don't get me wrong, like I live for this, but we're in the business of entertainment. It is entertainment under the guise of professional sport. And I think when you get your head around that, it helps you to actually live in that ecosystem. And you go into it with this very altruistic idea of we're just doing the best science and the best medicine, but ultimately we're doing that within an ecosystem of entertainment. And I think to be successful in this, you have to kind of be able to balance both.
Yeah, it's a little bit. You said you'd worked with the Olympic athletes, right? So entertainment, but their main goal is obviously to be at their peak performance every 4-year cycle. So how do you see them training, how therapy staff interact with them versus like pro sports?
I think the fame and the fortune and the means of professional sport, and also look, the NBA and basketball is something. I mean, basketball is a difficult sport to play. If you're playing 35, 40 minutes a night, don't get me wrong, as much as you might be only running 5K a game and your soccer players are running 10 to 12, a lot of the 10 to 12K your soccer players are racking up or at walking or very, very light jogging pace. The high A cells and high D cells we get in basketball far and away outnumber what you get in even the most aggressive soccer player that I've seen data on. And so I think that part of it is, if you're talented enough to be able to do that and then go out and have a good time and what have you, and then come back tomorrow and do that again, in the professional sports world, you've got the means to do that. You're now in the Olympics, you're working with the top of the top. There's going to be 8 people in that final or however, whatever sport you're in. And if you want a chance on the podium, you're now, you're competing with that number one best person in the world. And I think, it's a different level of training the physiology to get to that level. People talk now about heart rate variability all the time, and it really bugs me because your heart rate variability, A, measuring it on an Oura ring or by distal pulse is, it's correlated, but it's not our interval, it's not super accurate. But B, it's really useful in measuring, these distinct changes in training and how your body's, responding to those changes when you're pushing the limit. But it's also, pretty good at picking up that you went out for a night drinking, or that the plane didn't get in until 4 a.m., or that, whatever those things are. So, using these like elite mechanisms to measure our professional athletes, I say this all the time, and again, it's unpopular because ownership groups and what have you, they love shiny things, they love tech, they love fancy bells and whistles. But if our players in the NBA sleep, eat a good diet, train, and I'll say train because, and again, I'm not taking a shot at Kawhi because I know Kawhi's therapist very, very well, and I know I have insight into Kawhi's program, but train. And this is where load management has gone a bit too far, in my opinion, because we don't train now in the NBA. If you haven't been in it, but a lot of the top teams is, training is not intense every day. If you're a bottom team with a bunch of rookies, yes, it probably is. Some coaches it might be, but so if you're training and then you're taking care of your body, you're going to be a great NBA player and you're going to have longevity. Those are the real key things that you need to do. But if you do all those and you want to win the Olympic 100 meters, yes, you're not going to cut it. You're not going to be there, sorry. And so that's the difference.
Yeah,
The
and sometimes
athletes,
like and I've worked field hockey as well, and sometimes like and those guys have pros, but their pros not like the NBA or NHL where you can kind of retire on like a big lump sum. So for me, it's almost like it's nicer working with those people because there's not that big shiny paycheck at the end. They're playing their hearts out, training their hearts out, but there's no big multi-million-dollar contract at the end. And in the end, they're still going to have to get a job, and they're pouring their guts out for this time period, and they love it for what it is. And that's how I got into sports. I was never going to be necessarily a pro athlete, but they're once the money starts coming, and not to say they don't deserve it. It's just there's a lot of different strings getting pulled there, not just performance. Like you said, with the Olympics, it's like you just want to be the best, whether or not you're going to get that, Michael Phelps, Simone Biles, like endorsement. Like a lot of those people will get gold medals, but still have to go home, get a job, and, maybe coach a bit here or there. But, most of them are not going to see that huge multi-million dollar endorsement.
yeah, and there's definitely a lot to be said for that. There's also a lot to be said on the flip side of that for the pressure of getting it right. If you screw it up, it's on ESPN, it's on the ticker, everybody's seeing it, everybody's asking about it. It's like and I love and I thrive on that pressure, and you don't get that with the other group of athletes. And so there's a balance, I think, there as well. If you really thrive on that type of pressure and making those small margins and really trying to be precise and getting it right every time, which of course we don't always do, but trying to. I also enjoy that part of it as well. So.
Do you find that you, as the therapist, do you feel like you guys are as much under the microscope when you guys manage like injuries or rehab, even though it's not necessarily on, TV or Hard Knocks or something like, but do you still get like media questions or people press releases that you have to go to that talk about that stuff?
Part of my job is to help media, and so part of my job is, and it was in Philly, it is at Gotham, is to help formulate press releases. It's less, I guess, arduous here because of the league that we're in. It was a very big deal with Ben Simmons, Joel Embiid, these names in Philly, and so sitting with our PR people and formulating how we're going to report an injury and those sorts of things, having a general manager across the table. You said this was going to be 2 weeks, it's now 3 weeks. What the hell is going on? Having answers to those questions, being able to manage that is a big part of the job. And so, yeah, definitely you're under the microscope, whether it's publicly or privately within the organization.
And then any sort of opinion you have like is going to be scrutinized heavily, like, oh, you said he was going to be fine if it goes wrong. Likewise, if they say like, oh, he's career mate, and they may be like, oh, well, wait a second, like let's get another opinion, because you don't want to push your athlete too far. So when you're advocating for your athletes, maybe taking a little bit more time off, but they're going to go, just like in most people, like they're going to go with the evidence they want to see, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, no, you'll see the evidence that you want to. And there's a lot of people out there that will make promises that they can't deliver on, either through lack of experience, lack of knowledge, trying to get their foot in the door. The one thing, we all have is our integrity. And if we put the player first, I've lost jobs because of that. I'd rather lose a job because I took care of my player, my patient, did the right thing ethically, both for myself and for them. To me, that's all I've got at the end of the day.
Cool. Anyways, I'll let you continue on.
So let's talk about performance team structures because we've talked a little bit about this. This is your really classic performance team structure, and you can kind of see now where physical therapists fit in here, and there might be one or two or depending on the team. We've got head athletic trainer, assistant athletic trainer. A lot of leagues mandate athletic trainers, and again, they're very, very good with our on-field management and that type of thing. We are less trained in that, at least at a postgraduate degree level. Obviously, we have that now in our residencies and so on and so forth. But typically, you have this performance side, you have this medical side. The head coach has a dotted line to each director, and then they answer to the general manager. The number one thing I hear from teams all over the country, no matter what the sport, is that our performance and our medical team, they're not on the same page. They don't collaborate well. They're often at loggerheads. Well, just take a look at the structure. Is it any wonder that they're not on the same page? Where have you created room for collaboration between the two groups in the structure of this? And my good friend, if you come across her, you can listen to her talk about this. Nicole Serdiker talks about this as well, and she's just finished a degree program in performance teams from the UK. But we were sharing a text exchange the other night, and we were talking about this exact thing. And so it's very frustrating, I think, when I won't name the club, but I visited an MLS club recently. Brand new, beautiful facility, absolutely everything done, I would say almost perfectly, top of the line. And I walked into the performance department, and there was this room, and everybody's computers there. And then I walked out and down the hall to the gym, and then I walked through the gym and around the corner and around the back, and there were the treatment tables in the medical room. And so if you have a separate space like that, and it's separated by both the org chart and the physical space within the organization, how do you breed and foster this cross collaboration? And so one thing that I'm really passionate about is improving that. And so I believe in letting your architecture drive your culture. If you want collaboration, you have to create an architecture that fosters this collaboration. And by creating gaps in the network system, you inevitably force somebody to go talk to somebody else internally to get the information that they need to do their job. And if you've empowered them to do that rather than to go vertically to the director, then they solve problems internally. They work together internally to collaborate for the good of the athlete. And so that's what I said about building at Gotham when they first hired me as a consultant, and then when I came on full time, and I had the opportunity to really try this structure. And so this is us currently at Gotham with me just as an umbrella over the top. Yes, I still treat players, so I'm still hands-on, but for the most part, I'm overseeing everything. We eliminated, other than for the designation of the league, because we have to, but we eliminated the head athletic trainer. We have athletic trainers, they work together. We said, here are the tasks that you guys need to do, but I'm going to let you self-organize. I'm going to let you guys decide, well, you're really great at this. You're very good organizationally over here. I'm going to do the inventory. I'm going to work with liaising with physicians and scheduling our massages. And I let them do that and empowered them to do that. The light blue are our consultants, and we did that to be fiscally efficient. But we brought in a performance therapist to link the physical therapy side and then our pitch-based and strength and conditioning side to kind of be that link between the early acute injury management and then the later stage pitch-based rehab. So we now have a direct connection. So when we're looking at periodizing our rehab and our heavy days in the gym and our tissue response to the load that we're doing and all of those things, it's all connected. We're all having these conversations. I'm rehabbing a national team ACL right now within our team. And it's pretty fun when your strength coach programs a day and you look at it and you see 4 of the rehab exercises you were going to do that day in his programming because you're on the same page. And so now you walk into the gym and you're like, well, I only got to do 2 things with you today because it's in your lift and he's already programmed it. And that's what we're shooting for. Are we perfect? No. Have we absolutely, achieved every aspect of this? Not yet. But that's the goal that we're working towards, and we've let our structure drive that. Now, one of the problems with this structure is that it creates a little bit of a rod for my back because everything ultimately ends up with me over the top. And that's something that I'm working on the process of figuring out now. But I can truly tell you, and I don't say this lightly because I've been around a lot, I love, love, love my team within our medical performance department at Gotham. And it is the most collaborative group that I have ever worked with in sport. Do we have the top people in each of their professions? No, we have people that we're developing, people that have super potential, people that have worked in other professional environments and people that haven't, people from, really diverse backgrounds, some people that have come predominantly from the clinic, some people that have come from professional teams, some people that have worked in professional sport a long time, some people that have worked in a short time. But that diversity and working across, the collaborative environment has created a really fun group to work with. So I would like to think that it's been successful. And I just finished my staff's mid-year performance reviews, and they were fairly glowingly positive of what we've done. So I'd like to think that they think the same thing as well. So.
Scott, would you say that, but I mean, you created that model. Would you say that's very different than, say, the model or hierarchy of other professional teams?
I've never seen it done, to be honest, like that. I haven't seen a model that was intentionally created that way, with the goal of actually achieving that, and I poured over that for hours and hours and days as a consultant with the team before I came on full time. And I took a leadership course through Wharton early last year. And the idea of letting architecture drive culture came out of that. And then I let that ruminate and just kind of thought about how we could do that at Gotham. I don't think there's a perfect structure. I don't think it exists. I think there's the right structure for the right team and the right environment. This structure would not work in a lot of teams, but it works for us.
Yeah, I mean, the structures that I've seen were the previous structure. I think you put up the performance team structure where everything's siloed, and in the end, it's like it's whose head's going to get cut off if something goes wrong. So they want that hierarchy. It's very militaristic. Like you can't say anything. You got to wait till the next person. You can't even give your opinion because God forbid it's going to be different from the head physician or head ATC, like you're saying, like a lot of teams have. And part of that is because we're dealing with multi-million-dollar media releases, and now they have like sports betting that's legal, which is crazy, right? So like I think that's one of the things that has definitely led to that, and I think that's why there's such a militaristic structure. But at the same time, militaristic structure doesn't allow for collaboration, sharing things, or even like voicing your opinion if you're below that other person. And of course, when you don't share information, then that's where things fall through the cracks and people start getting, things start getting missed, and things don't go the way you want it to for the athlete.
The first thing I did when I came in as a consultant in our performance and medical meetings every day was I started going around the room and saying, "What do you think? And what do you think? And I want to hear your opinion and tell me what you would do here in this situation." And at first, it was very confronting because the group that we had then, it's a very different group now, but the group that we had then, that wasn't happening. And it was hard to extract that information from people. But eventually we normalized it. And now my staff will call me out and I'll say something and they're like, no, I can see the look on their face. And I'll be like, you disagree with me, tell me what you think. We have an open forum. Like it's like, call me out, you've worked in soccer way longer than I have. I want to know, what have you seen done? What's worked best here? Sometimes I come up with crazy ass basketball ideas that that come from my basketball background and don't fit soccer. So, you know. Ed, you asked me to talk a bit about, my research, and it's something that, has been a labor of love. I'm not a paid academic, but I do think that this has definitely, kept me intellectually stimulated. It's kept me constantly reading the literature, constantly seeking information and understanding, injuries and injury mechanisms. I've published a lot on bone and imaging, and then our papers on injury in the NBA, particularly anterior cruciate ligament and Achilles tendon ruptures, and so uh, you know, that's been a passion of mine. It's sometimes hard to fit it in amidst everything else, but I've been very lucky to have an amazing group of co-authors. You'll see a lot of similar names on a lot of these papers that I've worked with, and together, we all share a bit of the load, and we're able to publish this work and hopefully, contribute to the profession as a whole and advance the conversation about your injury and injury prevention, injury treatment, and that's been a very rewarding part of my career, particularly over the last probably 6, 7 years.
Do you publish as an independent, or do you have to kind of collaborate with an academic institution?
I've done both. Generally speaking, it's easier to get your research published if you're collaborating with other co-authors from an academic institution. But you'll see a lot of times here I'm publishing as an independent researcher under my name.
Now, do you think your involvement with research is one of the reasons that you have been like considered for a lot of these high performance jobs or consulting?
I don't know how much of a difference that makes necessarily. I think it's certainly one of the reasons why, I get involved with the MBA research, projects and things like that. I get invited to the MBA Combine to speak in those types of things and some of those more academic, higher academic conferences. Um, I think it definitely is appealing. I don't have a PhD. PhD has become the latest shiny, thing, and so I think, that's probably something that I would like to go on and get. But I still love practicing, and I still love doing what I'm doing, and I'm not ready to become purely an academic. But I'm certainly looking at ways I can do that and combine that with what I'm doing. I think people see the degree more than the research sometimes, but yeah, for me, it's about the product of work and the body of knowledge and advancing that body of knowledge more than just having the degree.
Cool. Is that do you have your PhD, or is that something in the works?
No, that's something that I'd like to work on, and I've been talking to a few different people about how I can go about that whilst continuing to do what I'm doing. You asked me for some experiences, and so as we wrap up, I'm going to play a little funny experience here, and then tell you a little anecdote, and we're getting close to being over time, so I won't ramble on too long. But here's a funny experience, and I'll tell you how this ends up. I'll play once more. I'm sure you caught it. So we just told Joel Embiid that his minutes were done for the night, and that he had to come out of the game, and that was his response, caught on ESPN and all over ESPN the next day and for the best part of the next week. And so, how do you handle an athlete in the heat of the moment? They're very emotional, and how do you kind of build those relationships? And Joe and I had a number of conversations very early in my time in Philly, pretty direct with Joe, and they didn't always go well, and Joe didn't always talk to me after that for a while, but I continued to be a consistent person giving trusted advice. And we have a great relationship now. Actually saw Joe the other day. And so what you have at the end of the day in this job is really the relationships that you build with your players. And I put this in as an example of, yeah, that could be, go very bad and you could end up, having a deteriorating relationship and it's your star player and you get fired, or you can manage that relationship well. You can understand that's the heat of the moment that this player's had a heat of the moment, kind of very disappointed, doesn't want to come out of the game, very emotional, very competitive, and you manage that and you move on. So, where does that end up? I mean, I helped Joel design the Embiid ones. One of the things that no one will ever knew I did, but I had a very, very big hand in, and I learned a lot about shoe design and shoe structure, and that's helped me now with other players and working with shoe companies and things like that. Joe ends up winning the MVP. I was still consulting for him. I was making all of his orthotics at the time. And when he wins the MVP, I send him a message, and his response to the left on text is, "Thank you for everything. You've been a huge part of the story, and it isn't over yet, so thank you." And so I put that full circle story in there about, you have a moment, it could blow up, it could go bad, you could manage that poorly, but you're always building these relationships. And that's really what you do. And so when I think about my career, it's not the big moments on court or the big moments on the field that I actually remember. It's the private moments with players, the things that they've chosen to share with me about their family, the things that we've had, the private conversations we've had. Those are the things that I remember the most, and those are the things that I hold the dearest about my career. And I think you can't lose sight of that.
Yeah, we had a question actually.
Yeah.
One of Nisha asked just, and I know you've been in this position where you've been like a personal consultant for a player as opposed to a team. When certain sports, like for example, NBA has their own physical therapists, and how do in both these models presented, how does the communication typically go? Like, where does that personal therapist kind of fit into that model?
It varies. So you could be embedded as I was, and that happens more and more. You could be external to the team, but seeing the player outside. Sometimes they'll give you access to the facility, sometimes they won't. As a team person, I've dealt with that. And what I tend to try to do is bring that person close. I try to, encourage them to share information. I share information with them. I try not to keep them at arm's length. I think the better relationship you have with the player's person, the better that relationship with the player is going to go. As the external person, you're trying to balance your relationship with the player and the agent with the team, and you're really, you've got your professional relationships, often with people on the team, working at a high level in sport. Everybody knows everybody. You somehow, either directly or, through 3 degrees of separation, know this person you're working with. You're trying to maintain that relationship on the team side, but then you're also trying to maintain the autonomy that you have and the trust with the player and the agent. It's a very difficult balance. It's something that, I think is, I hope I have done a decent job of that. I've tried very, very hard to do a good job of that. But sometimes you're serving, the master who's paying your paycheck, but also then, your own professional integrity, as I alluded to earlier. And sometimes that can be a very difficult balance. I'm not going to lie.
Thanks.
So finally, Ed, you asked me to have a brief chat about all the Achilles ruptures, and we'll wrap up on this in the NBA. This is some data from our paper, and I think I alluded to this before, but contrary to previous information that's out there, we found that 35% of ruptures had previously missed time with Achilles tendonitis. Now, there was this old adage that if you had tendonitis, you're probably less likely to rupture your Achilles, but it turns out from our data in the NBA that that's actually not the case. And I think we're maybe one of the first kind of people to really draw attention to this. 17% had ankle-related injuries, and 13 knee, and then 10% calf injuries, with other small soft tissue injuries rounding out. But you can see that, a very large, foot inflammation, 17%, 17% ankle, 35% Achilles, a very large slice of that pie had lower limb injuries that they had missed time for leading up to their Achilles tendon ruptures. And I alluded to the fact that maybe we're not talking enough about this in the rehab from these particular injuries. And you can see the numbers below on the return to play. Now, I think what's really interesting is that the ankle injuries, 16 days return to play versus 24. The calf injuries, 12 days versus 26, almost double. The plantar fascia injuries, 13 days versus 30, again, double. But look at the Achilles-related injuries. There was no difference between those who ruptured and missed time for Achilles tendinopathy and those who didn't rupture. So as much as Achilles tendinopathy was a feature of those who ruptured, the time missed didn't seem to make that big a difference. And so I think that's important. In our study with the NBA G League that we did on patella tendinopathy last season, that we presented at the Combine again this year, about 80% of our G League players have patella tendon pathology, right? They have tendinosis. And I think, you know, the Achilles tendon is much less than that, to be fair. It's much less common in NBA players, but the patella tendon has that level of pathology. So I think, you know, there's a lot we don't know, and there's a lot of people pontificating about all of this stuff right now. There's people blaming footwear. Maybe there's an issue there. You know, obviously people blaming training load, people blaming what's happening in youth leagues and AAU and the number of games people are playing during these really crucial developmental times for your tendons. And we know that adolescence is really crucial in tendon development now. I think that might be a factor. The extension of our MBA study is hopefully going to be to include some of these youth age groups and to track them over time and have a look at that. But the truth of the matter is I'm not really certain what the cause is, and we've probably looked at this as much, if not more, than anybody in between our multiple papers on Achilles' mechanism of rupture and prior injuries. And you know, it's difficult to come to an exact conclusion. We need to do more research. We need to understand better. This year we had 8 ruptures in the NBA, and previously we've averaged between 1 and 2. So I think it's about 1.6 or something is the average year in, year out over like the last 15 years or so. And then we have 8 this year. Is that just a statistical glut? Somebody on Twitter asked me, well, is it related to the playoffs? And so I did a chart, and I looked at that, at the Achilles ruptures temporally. And what you see in the first chart is actually a very typical, if you've done injury epidemiology across multiple sports, and I've done that for, you know, now soccer, I've done it in the NHL, I've done it in basketball, and then you look at research in the NFL, this is the graph, the top here, that mimics nearly every professional sport in terms of the temporal sequence of injuries. Early preseason, you get a spike. Around December, January, you get a spike. Kind of late in the season, you get a spike, and during playoffs, it kind of drops down a little bit. This is very classic. So when I see this injury pattern, I'm like, okay, that kind of fits with, if we put ankle injuries there, if we put knee injuries there, if we put, you know, we'd probably see a pattern, overall injuries that looks very similar. But the difference is in October, November, December, January, all the way through till early April, I've got about 450 players on available roster playing. Okay, so 15 players, you know, multiply that by 30 teams. But come playoffs, all of a sudden that shrinks. Now I got 16 teams, I got 8 teams, I got 4 teams, I got 2 teams. And so now if I just, and this is a very rough math, I didn't like go into all the exact numbers and do this, but I just did this to give it, if I break this down by the number of players and the number of ruptures that we had, now granted in June, we only had 4 ruptures, but if I break it down per the number of player available to play on a team at each given time, look at what happens in the playoffs. There's a huge spike. And so maybe we're willing to take more risks in the playoffs. And we think about Halliburton, we think about this calf strain data over here. We think about Kevin Durant, we think about this calf strain data here. We don't know what was happening with Jason Tatum. I'm not aware of that one. I don't know. Was there something else he'd been dealing with? But when you look at that, I think that the playoff spike is potentially related to the fact that it's playoffs. You're going to risk it for the biscuit. You're going all in. And I think that's a factor. And on that, it's time for a wine.
Well, thanks a lot, Scott. I was just wondering, anybody have any last pressing questions or concerns that they wanted to bring up before we wrap up with Scott? Definitely thank you for your time. I know you're busy. I'm just glad that we were able to kind of organize this with the Women's Professional League kind of break. I know you start up again, but you're, like you said, always busy. So thank you for your time for sure. Any last pressing questions for Scott from anybody? No? Oh,
I mean, I
Nisha?
could also just, text or email the question afterwards. It was more of like a personal question. But so, going along that like second track, you talked about the first track being more that residency and then getting more onto a team. That second track, more of that clinic, exposure, figuring out the knowledge gap, getting that knowledge gap, practicing that. If someone, so I'm like 10 years probably on that second track. The difficulty of that is again just finding people, like finding opportunities, and I've created small opportunities for myself here and there in different sports and different levels. What would you recommend, or what would you say is a good way to find jobs in professional sports? Where should I be looking and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, if you apply to all the jobs on Teamworks, you know, I'm going to get anywhere between 200 and 400 applicants. And some teams have a recruiter who's filtering those applicants out. I don't. I read every single application. I just am, that's just me, because I might miss a U. I might miss a U in there, and I don't want my recruiter filtering you out. But they'll filter it out by what university you graduated from, or they'll filter it out by some arbitrary measure that they think you should have a qualification or degree or experience in. So, in order to kind of beat that part of the system, I think you have to build relationships, and you have to start to network and get to know people, and then get them to know your work product in some way, shape, or form as well. It's not just about networking. I know people that are the most incredibly well networked. They're horrible clinicians, but boy, do they know anybody who's anybody. It's really about getting other people to understand your work product, which means, hey, can I come in? Can I shadow? Can if you come and shadow me, which unfortunately we don't take shadowing, so I'm sorry about that. But if you were to come and shadow me, I'm going to get a bit of a sense of who you are as a clinician by the questions you ask me. And I'm always looking at, what's this person asking me? Where's this person's head at when they're, asking me questions about different things? And, I think that's the first step. And then I start asking you some questions back. And then, if there's an opportunity to, hey, we've got a second team starting up, and we need some help for, a weekend tournament. Maybe you could help out, and those types of things start to happen. And then you start, oh yeah, the players really raved about you. Oh, that's great. Like, okay. And now those relationships, they start to build and they start to grow. And it's hard work. And and the second path is much harder. But I just think you build more longevity. Like if I leave Gotham tomorrow, I'm going to be okay. I will have players and athletes and people, and I'll have opportunities. It's, as I said, it's hard to break back into the pro sport ranks, and there's less and less jobs now that I'm a director of everything. Like there's 30 of them in the NBA. Some of them are not in cities I decided I want to live in my 50s, or whatever. But it's like, so now that narrows it down even more, because I'm like, I'm good. I think I'd like to live here instead, And so now there may be 15 that I might be willing to do. It's hard. As you move up the ranks, but to get in, and start getting in, that's the way to do it.
Yeah, just
Definitely enjoying
imagine
the
throwing kids in the
process.
mix.
And then absolutely.
Mhm.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Scott. If anybody has other questions, just forward them to me, and then I'll try to get them to Scott indirectly after. And then thanks again for your time, Scott. Great presentation. Loved it. And looking forward to see what you do with the rest of the season. And if there's life after Gotham, I'm sure a lot of us will be following you after that as well.
All right. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or what have you guys.
All right. Thanks a
All
lot.
right. Thank
Have a great
you.
night, guys.
Thank you so much. It was nice seeing you.
Thanks. Bye.